What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there, were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
Tonight's first story is called I Wish to Tell You of a Street That Traveled and the Monsters Living There. Written by Norman Crane. I grew up on a movable street. This requires explanation. In simplest terms, it means that from my birth into my eventual escape, although I spent every day of my life on the same street, the street itself traveled. To where and how often, I cannot say. When I escaped, it was in Pittsburgh. When I first saw the rolling, it was in Rome. I imagine the street traveled frequently, secretly, and globally. And I know it traveled as a rolled-up Armenian rug in the back of a white, unmarked delivery truck. But much beyond that remains a mystery to me. Because I am afraid I may have lost you by now, please allow me to explain from the beginning. Many years earlier. I want to start with my family. It was a large family, 2 parents and 5 siblings, 3 sisters and 2 brothers, of which I was the youngest, and we lived happily together in a large white house somewhere on the street. If I close my eyes, I still remember how the staccato felt against my hands as I ran them across the exterior walls, or on my bare back as I reclined against its textured warmth on a summer day while reading one of my books. I mention these sensations because I want to convince myself, and convince you, that the street, the house, and the people were real, and not just figments of my imagination. I remember everything about my family. That's why it breaks my heart to know I will never see them again. I am an orphan. But I am an orphan by choice, and at least I still have my books. Those transcendent books. Both my parents and my siblings worked in the same employment, a factory a short walk down the street from our home. From the day I turned 10, I also worked there. It was a wonderful place and we had lots of fun. Although we had set working hours, there was no oversight and we did largely as we pleased. Our job was simple, to make toys. Of all kinds and colors and shapes and materials. My favorites were musical dolls. You pulled a string and the doll played a beautiful and enchanting melody. Although it strikes me as strange today, at the time I never gave it a second thought that we were just only workers in the factory. Such a large building, with its high ceilings and resounding volume of emptiness. Yet I couldn't imagine sharing it with anyone, and I believed every family had its own factory which produced its own fine objects. I was certain that's how we obtained our furniture, our food, our dinnerware, our chemicals, and every other domestic necessity. Everything was delivered. My father mailed a request, and within days there it was, boxed up in the street and ready to be brought inside. There were other people who appeared on the street, the banker, the bookshop owner, the washers, but we didn't interact with them often, and my memories of them are hazy. There weren't any children my age, but my siblings were my friends and I was content in their sparse world of mystery and adults. Other sensations I remember about the streets are its yellow pavement, its majestic streetlights, the winds that rushed without warning up and down and across its expanse, and the monster. The monster was the reason my parents laid down the rules. 1. Never stay outside past sundown. 2. Never venture off the street. And 3. Never read any of the unapproved books. It was ultimately a book, albeit an approved one, that began my process of realization. As far back as I remember, I loved to draw. I was the only one in my family with talent for art, which put my parents in the unusual position of having to provide new supplies for me, for we had no used pastels, paints, or art books. One day, they called me to the living room and presented me with a gift-wrapped package of art supplies, sketchbooks, and 2 leather-bound volumes that I would so learn to cherish. A Brief Illustrated History of Western Art by R.W. Watson, and Drawing Materials and Techniques, 2nd edition, by Vladimir Kunin. It was from the latter I learned about negative space, lighting, and perspective. And it was while sitting with my sketchbook on my knees while reclining against our white stucco walls, drawing what I saw rather than what I believed to be, that I first noticed something off about the streets and therefore about the world. Because, try as I might, when I drew the view of the street before me, the perspective lines of the various objects and buildings did not make sense. At first, I erased my lines and tried again, over and over until the paper was as thin as skin. I was sure I was the one making the mistake, each time. However, I achieved the same incorrect result. I drew what was, but not what should have been. Frustrated, I put down the sketchbook and picked up Watson instead, eager to flip its endless pages of artworks and prove to myself that it was in fact Koonin and his rules about perspective who was wrong. I am not sure for how long I looked at landscape after landscape after landscape, but it must have been for over an hour. When I lifted my head and gazed upon the street once more, it was immediately apparent that it was indeed the street which was distorted. Koonin was right. Reality was wrong. I said nothing to my parents or siblings, but continued with my observations, and over the following weeks discovered that not only perspective but also light transgressed the rules. The effect this had on me is difficult to describe, but it was profound. I can only ask that you imagine yourself in a room with two objects, a table and a chair, and one light source. Yet the shadow of the table contradicts the shadow of the chair, and as you cross the room you realize you cast no shadow at all. Had I been a few years younger, I would have likely brought my findings to my parents' attention, and they would have soothed my fears with adult words and children's stories, taken away my art books, and hugged me until the fog of desirable forgetfulness rolled in. Perhaps I even would have done so at the time, if not for another, far more sinister experience. For the first time, I transgressed the rules. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and after finishing my workday at the factory, I took my usual route home. But instead of going inside to eat dinner and read one of my books by the fireplace, I walked past. Various buildings lined the street, some similar to ours, others resembling the factory, and others wholly different, and one by one, I knocked on their doors. No one answered. When I was beyond sight of our home, the wind picked up. It was a chill and howling wind that seemed to originate in some impossible, distant, and unknown place, and which penetrated me to the marrow of my bones. In my old state of mind, I would have turned back. Now I persisted. Despite walking for more than half an hour, the sun began to set, and an unexpected, heavy darkness fell upon the street. The streetlights turned on, but I saw how their illuminated cones sinned subtly against the natural laws of light. It was night. I was more scared than ever I had been on the street, and knew that I was breaking a rule, but I thought, if reality itself can break the rules, why not I? That's when I saw her. A little girl strolling ahead, so innocent and tiny in the void between the buildings looming on either side of her. She wore a big backpack but was alone, and for reasons I cannot truly explain, I knew immediately that she was not of the street, but herself a stranger to it. For a span of time, I walked behind her. She walked in silence, broken only intermittent by the wind. Then I heard the first notes of a familiar melody, perhaps a passage from Strauss or Dvorak, and the girl heard it too, for she stopped and turned her body, first one way, then the other, to find where the melody was coming from. And it was in the very moment when she finally seemed to locate its source, a narrow alley between two buildings both so much resembling my family home, that I placed my own knowledge of the music. You pulled a string, and the doll played a beautiful and enchanting melody. The girl stepped toward the alley, and on a wall opposite, I saw. The monster's shadow spilled ominously across the darkened rocks and mortar. A shadow without a light. Night obscured by something darker than itself. Flung across the cobblestone, following the girl into the alley. The wind shrieking and fumed and died. And in the sudden stillness the street flickered. I flickered. Then a child's solitary scream pierced the stagnant air, echoing ever and ever fainter. It was only when silence had returned that I found the courage to peer inside the alley. The girl was gone, and there were no shadows, but resting peacefully on the ground I saw a backpack and a doll. I entered, knowing now what it was the washers searched for in the street, and sat down reverently beside the backpack as it was a grave. It was filled with exotic clothing, strange books, and many unfamiliar objects. Like the girl, they were not of the street, although each subsequent second spent in the alley filled me with dread. I inspected the objects carefully in turn before returning to the backpack, all but one, a book titled David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. When I rejoined the street, evening had replaced the night. The sun hung sullen above the horizon. Making my way back home, I thought about what it was I had seen and felt, and realized for the first time that the street was false and hideous and his. It existed for him. We existed for him, working every day to aid him in his evil. I wanted to believe that my parents and siblings knew nothing of the monster's crime, but I could not. At best, I could attribute them to an ignorance stemming from a willful lack of curiosity, a perpetual turning of the blind eye. But is that truly so different from knowing? At worst, they knew it all, in detail and forever, as in the fact that they joyfully churned out lures with which the monster caught his prey as he and we traveled in the street round and round the world. I almost made it home when from behind I heard a sudden whining, as in ancient mechanical gears. I turned in time to see the half-set sun spin. Then two men spoke, but their voices came from without the heavens, above the street, and they spoke a language I did not understand. What happens next I still shudder to recall, yet find myself unable to properly convey in words. It was this reality, by which I mean all I saw before me, the street, its buildings, and the land and sky, compressed, losing all depth, and became as if painted upon the face of a great cosmic wave, arising from none into existence, and I, standing on an impossible shore, saw it curve and roll up reality, growing and roaring and approaching until it was a great tsunami. Then down it crashing came, and I too was more flat and rolled. I woke in my own bed. It was morning, and as I bounded down the stairs of the living room, I noted that nothing was out of place or even slightly changed. I returned upstairs in a cold sweat, and perhaps would have considered it all a nightmare if not for Charles Dickens, whose David Copperfield lay closed atop my bed sheets. I slid shivering into bed, opening the covers, and read my first unapproved book. I didn't read it in one sitting, but I devoured it within a week, sometimes going over chapters again and again and imagining the world they described, which is not my world, but which I was nevertheless convinced was the truth. To my family, I wasn't altered, but in my heart I knew I must escape the street. I continued drawing and painting, but I no longer paid attention to the irregularities around me. Instead, I used my art as time alone to think. Indeed, it was like rolling one of my many painted canvases that I hit upon the idea of the street itself as a painted canvas, and that what I had experienced as the rolling of reality was akin to the rolling of a canvas. I thought about why I rolled my canvases, to keep them safe and to transport them. And with every new idea I felt not only the electricity of excitement, but the birth of an escape plan. A canvas, I knew, had edges. The street might also have edges. A canvas was often shaped and aligned in a way to complement its content. The street might also be as so aligned. Based on what I had experienced, I theorized the street must have an end, else how could it be rolled? But that it might be nearly infinitely long, so attempting to escape down its length would be impossible. What, however, of its width? For my entire life, I had lived on and along the street. I decided it was time I tried walking away from it. I had made my attempt 3 days later. My mind was an amalgamation of fear and expectation as I cut into an alley, much like the one in which the girl had disappeared, then pressed perpendicularly onward. I forbid myself from looking back, yet my imagination fabricated mental images of shadows in pursuit. I trudged past them, and some time later noticed the details of the world around me were degrading in grayness, haze, and an overall lack of sharpness and precision. I felt like I had entered the background of a giant painting, and then, over an ashen hill, I saw the dynamic, focused colors and heard the absolute chaos of a mass of people in the living, breathing world. Your world. The real world. I stopped short of crossing over, but I stared, mesmerized by its alienness. Its brilliance and complexity took my breath away. Much later, I identified one of the buildings I had seen as the Arch of Constantine, which proved to me that I had been in Rome. But having seen its edge, I returned to the street. That had always been the plan. I had to know the edge existed before I could escape it, and as I stepped through the door to my home, my parents and siblings flocking around me. I had been gone almost a week. I made the decision to leave them behind forever. In those initial moments of love and excitement, as we embraced each other, I even tried to introduce them to the fraction of a truth, a mere insinuation of doubt. But they would not have it. They scolded me and warned me and laughed at the suggestion that the street was not the world, and in the morning they were dutifully to work in the factory. I packed my things and walked the street for the last time, wiping tears and feeling the weight of the task ahead. Not only living the only home I'd ever known, but learning to create a new one in a foreign world. I did experience a few moments of weakness during which I felt compelled to turn back, but I only to remember the girl's scream and its still reverberating echoes. A sound like that never truly dissipates. It haunts the world eternal. By the time I entered the background, the wind was picking up. I knew that meant a rolling was imminent. I sped up and spotted the edge just as the first corner of faux reality bent upwards. This time there was no drama. I was already standing at the edge, between the blurred grayness of the extreme background and vivid energy of the real world, when the cosmic wave looped threateningly above me. I closed my eyes and stepped onto a concrete sidewalk, like I have done countless times since. I was on a side road in a downtown Pittsburgh, which may not sound as exciting as Rome, but you couldn't have told that to my beating heart. Cars drove past, pedestrians avoided me while giving me the dirtiest looks, and I must have been wide-eyed and dumbstruck. With my hand on my chest, feeling the pounding of the unshackled vitality that you simply call life, everything was new to me. I was terrified and exhilarated, and when I looked to see where I had come from, there was nothing. Pittsburgh continued in all directions. I barely noticed, perhaps 100 feet away, an unmarked, white delivery truck, into which two men were shoving a rolled-up Armenian rug. When they spoke, I may not have understood their words, but I recognized their voices. The only difference was now that the voices originated the world I was in. After maneuvering the rug into the truck, they got in and took off. What a bizarre feeling it is to see your entire world thrown into a truck and driven off, like it actually was a rug to be delivered to someone's living room. It makes you feel both otherworldly and small. Then you remember the monster, and the monster's helpers, who are your family. And you wish you had done something to stop the truck, because you feel that what to the rolled-up world was not of the street is right in front of you. The monster's victims are as real as Pittsburgh, and he's still out there, in a delivery truck somewhere, waiting for his street to be unrolled. Our next story is called Yesterday, I Was Murdered by Hotel Entropy. Her body was discovered by her neighbor, an elderly man who, in a stroke of horrible luck, came to ask her for some assistance. The coroner would have later confirmed she had died a mere few hours before. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of a break-in, nothing that pointed to any malevolence. But then we noticed her phone, propped up right across from her, and found that damn recording, in which a beautiful, yet exhausted, girl took a seat and started talking. I wish I had never seen it. Yesterday, I was murdered. Any other person could have spoken these words, and I've instantly dismissed them as absolutely insane, but not her. For a second, she glanced at her smartwatch when it buzzed, taking a deep breath as she did. He told me his name was Jack Riley, though in hindsight, I couldn't tell you whether or not that was a lie. What I do know is that he's a surgeon, a neurosurgeon. The same little routine repeated. Her watch buzzed, and other than her taking a nervous breath, nothing happened. I wonder if Jack was stalking her, drowning her in messages. We've had a few dates. He had been a perfect gentleman throughout all of it. The only thing he absolutely hated was people taking things for granted, he told me. I adored his grateful attitude. Again a buzz, a sigh. Yesterday we met up at his. I was complaining about work and something just changed in him. Tears were welling up in her eyes. I'm not sure what happened after that, but I woke up in my own apartment, a tube stuck in my throat. which she removed the moment our eyes met. Once more, her lips were turning slightly blue, her skin growing paler, yet she simply kept talking through her sobs. Apparently there's a part in my brain, medulla or something, that makes our body work for us. It keeps our heart beating, our blood flowing, and so on, without having to think about it. One of the many things we hold for granted. And then he told me he had found a way to tweak it. Didn't even have to crack open my skull. No way to fix it either. He told me I should have been more grateful. Another buzz. And with it, my anxiety grew. There was not a touch of pink left in her. If I leave, my parents are next. I've tried to keep going for as long as I could, but I'm exhausted. So this is goodbye, I think. To whoever found this, whoever found me, I'm sorry you had to see me like this. I left letters for some people in my bed. Tell them I love them and... She slumped down. None of us moved for several silent minutes, until I walked over to her body and took off her watch, seeing, for the first time, the hundreds of reminders she set. Breathe. Our next story is called The Hobbled Man by Opinionated IMO. I first noticed him one night while stumbling home from the pub. It was actually in the early morning hours, and not many souls were out and about. Fewer still had a pronounced limp and heavy footfall as he did. Despite his physical infirmity, the dour gent limping behind me managed to traverse the well-worn cobblestones with no issues. The progress he made toward his unknown destination was roughly at the same pace as my own. We continued on, in uncomfortable silence. Neither of us addressed or acknowledged the other. Besides the odd coincidence of both wandering the streets at the ungodly hour of 3 a.m., I didn't place much thought to the hobbling gentleman 15 paces behind me. I assumed we were just two random fools making our way home in the pre-dawn hours, in a walk of shame. He kept to his side of the roadway, and I stayed on mine. In my hazy stupor, I was too preoccupied with preventing myself from falling face down to engage in pleasantries. Walking required my full attention. A few nights later, I hurried to the market on Huxton Row to buy some fresh groceries. The proprietor closes precisely at 9 p.m., without fail. The stoic merchant was standing right beside his doorway waiting to lock up shop. I assured him I would only be a moment. I told him what I needed, handed him the money, and thanked him for his patience. Off I went, back toward my humble home. He locked the door and departed in the other direction. I breathed a sigh of relief as I walked down the boulevard in the flickering glow of the streetlights. The missus would have had her rolling pin waiting on yours truly if I'd failed to pick up the goods. All was well until I heard that ungraceful footfall behind me again. I didn't want to face him, but my curiosity got the best of me. I felt compelled to make eye contact with the stumbling codger. I glanced over my shoulder, as much to reassure myself as for him. I wish I hadn't. His features were stark and his eyes were lifeless and cold. It chilled me to the marrow. Worse, he completely failed to acknowledge my startling gaze. As before in our previous encounter, we walked separately. This time, however, I was stone-cold sober and more aware of the solitary situation. I felt vulnerable walking in front and began to doubt we were headed to different places. The labored presence directly behind me was very unnerving. I felt it wasn't a coincidence. I kept running into the hobbled man. His distinctive, uneven cadence somehow married up with his own natural gait. We were in full lockstep until it was difficult to tell them apart. Our footfalls echoed in the cold winter air. Clip, clip, clunk, clip, clip, clunk. It was just out of sync enough to remind me I was being followed by a catatonic-looking ghoul with an asymmetrical shuffle and heaving breath. The hair on my head stood right up in prickles. I clutched my grocery sack tightly as if it was a defensive shield against an imminent attack. My eyes were full open and a fright. Then his pace seemed to quicken. Why was he tailing me? I thought I even felt hot, homicidal breath bearing down me goose-pimpled neck. I was practically sprinting in the pitch dark, having long since left behind the helpful torches of town. Right there, I had a full-blown panic attack. I tossed down my sack of groceries and raced home empty-handed. I was hyperventilating uncontrollably like a terrified child when I bolted up in the front door. The missus was waiting impatiently in the kitchen with an ever-present scowl of disappointment on her face. As soon as she saw my sheer fright, she dropped the rolling pin. I pulled back the curtain to determine if the stumbling cretin with the hollow, expressionless eyes was still in full pursuit. My betrothed could tell I was deathly afraid of something dire, and did her best to console the blubbering fool she had married. I calmed down a bit after a few sips of liquid courage, and tried to recount the cause for my extreme anxiety. She was genuinely concerned until I explained I was being followed by a handicapped cripple who hadn't made any aggressive moves against me at all. Hearing it expressed in the oversimplified, dismissive way, I realized it sounded ridiculous. Clearly, she agreed. Her matrimonial disgust returned with a vengeance. She ordered me to go back out immediately and retrieve our abandoned items. Already being a drunkard and an inattentive lout, I just added coward to my long list of undesirable traits. I backtracked until I found our discarded food lying on the ground. Thankfully, there was no sign of my menacing shadow looming about anymore, and I hurried back home, with my tail tucked between my legs. The missus hadn't experienced his callous sneer or felt the unshakable sense of doom surrounding him when he followed. I tried to explain that in greater detail, but she had absolutely no interest in hearing any sniveling from me. I shut my mouth and gave up. She was never going to understand. How could she? It didn't even make sense to me. This ominous shadow in dark clothes haunted my thoughts in ways which didn't appear to be justified. On the surface, he was simply a disfigured wretch with a prominent hobble who always seemed to wander the streets exactly when I did. My mysterious tormentor hadn't uttered a harsh word, nor raised a finger in malice towards me. His somber profile and disturbing demeanor alone created the irrational suspicions I held. In the clear light of day, I felt like a right silly git for being so spooked. He was merely an unfortunate, ghastly stranger as far as I or anyone else knew. As night fell, however, I wasn't nearly as sure of his coincidental benevolence. Over the next few evenings, I avoided the downtown area like the plague. In the back of my mind, I hoped my lame boogeyman was an aura of evil only came out at night. Sadly, I was wrong about that bit. I caught sight of old Stumbling Gruesome on a couple of occasions which neither night time nor was I alone. Regardless, every subsequent encounter served to magnify my paralyzing apprehension. I dared not point him out to my disappointed love. Either she'd mock me mercilessly for being so mortified by the mere sight of a harmless, unfortunate figure, or worse yet, she might not see him at all. In the back of my mind, that would have been enough to pack me in, square me away. He was just a miserable sot like me who I've created a fanciful mythology about him being an evildoer. That would be bad enough. But if no one else could see the innocent bugger, then my mind would have been gone. There's no cure for that. It would have been the old straitjacket and loony bin for Mr. Ian McTaskin. I didn't want to know if no one else could see him. The cunning way he was always seen to be closing in behind me, but then would disappear into thin air. Worried me far more than potential bodily harm by a lurking simpleton with a bum leg. Sunday morning, the vicar delivered their fire and brimstone sermon from the pulpit, as he always does. A broken record orator he is. My bride glared at me sideways, while listening to the repetitive lecture on the dire evils of drinking a few pints down at the pub. She was trying to decide if the holy words of wisdom might finally be sinking in, or if I'd always be a worthless drunkard who disappointed her daily. Truthfully, I hadn't been to the pub all week thanks to the creepy old sot who I kept running into. I played the part of the pious, repentant spouse, and she seemed temporarily satisfied that maybe there was some hope yet for my wayward soul. After all, it's a game as old as time itself. We both play it to make her feel good. Sadly, any tally marks I'd erased in her black book of marital mistakes were quickly replaced when I dared to ask the vicar about the hobbled man who was stalking my thoughts night and day. The wife was beyond furious I'd shamed her publicly by admitting the tale I'd told her. She assured it was merely alcohol-fueled nonsense and excused my forked tongue. That was before she saw the look on the preacher's solemn, weathered mug, it immediately changed the tune. "You saw a disgruntled-looking, lame fellow in a dark suit? Did he follow you for any distance at all, McTaskin? Oh, merciful Lord! The hobbled man evil spirit must have attached himself to an endangered soul. Has he stalked you more than once?" I nodded nervously at his volley of accusatory-sounding questions, as my ball and chain looking on in a rising tide of trepidation. Both their faces were aghast in widening mortal dread. While I wanted her to believe me about my stumbling shadow, I certainly didn't want to bring a heightened sense of despair into the process. They acted as if I had attached a demon from the fiery pits of hell to lurk directly behind me, all to snatch up my inebriated soul. I'll be deathly honest, their fear was contagious. I was already straddling the fence about my expressionless stalker being a diabolical spirit of the worst and most evil sort, but the vicar's marked awareness of his malicious entity and his aim for me was all the convincing I needed. I've been guilty in the past of the sin of pride, among many other well-documented failures, but I was lightning quick to beg for his holy guidance. I was down on my knees with fingers clasped to get shed of old Beelzebub. Most of the things I was directed to do was no real sacrifice. I had to attend church services every Sunday and pay my tithes to fund the Lord's work in combating evil throughout the world. I had to say me prayers each night and confess my dirty sins to gain the Lord's absolution. I was commanded to be more respectful to my sweet Connie McTaskin and to strive to be more of an honest man. That really paid off since he stopped hitting me with the rolling pin and frying pan and gave me loving on a regular basis. The only item I really struggled with was to give up the devil's medicine. The vicar demanded I stop going to the pub. That's the God's honest truth from my lips to your ears. I missed fellowship with the lads and throwing back a pint or two, but to his credit, not once did I run into the hobbled man again after I changed my ways and turned to the church. Eventually, I came to accept their noble sacrifice for the benefit of having my mortal soul and making sweet Connie love me again. That was until a decade later when I was introduced to M. Emmett Green, the vicar's crippled nephew. There was no telling how many errant husbands and body hell-raisers the hobbled man cleverly spooked with their creative ruse. Obviously, it worked masterfully on me to give up the bottle, and I realized immediately when I laid eyes on him that my wife knew the vicar's tricky plan all along. I'll admit, their sly deception inspired me to straighten my life, and I'm a better man for it, no doubt about it. You'd quit drinking too if you were followed by the hobbled man when you left the pub. It's probably what they mean when they say, the Lord works in mysterious ways. We're going to end the episode on a poem. It's called Saving This Family from Sin by Haunting Buyer 8532. Please save this family from sin. Our mother prays before our din. Please save this family from sin. The knife she wields is so thin. Please save this family from sin. The knife goes through, much like a pin. Please save this family from sin. She chants while purging all the kin. Please save this family from sin. The blood pours out, much like old gin. Please save this family from sin. A dying gasp escapes a chin. Please save this family from sin. Their death is our cue to dig in. I nibble on an intestine, all the while sporting a grin. The best purpose this feast has been, saving this family from sin. Thank you for listening this far if you have. I hope you have a great rest of your night, and remember to always face your fears.